The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect the policies and the position of Now You Know.
Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. Together with experts and newsmakers, we'll make sense of the week's biggest issues and stories. I'm Barnaby Lo. In tonight's conversation,
it has been a month of ups and downs in Philippines-China relations. A legislative investigation has revealed corruption within the Immigration Bureau that facilitated the entry of millions of Chinese into the Philippines. Meanwhile, the Philippine Navy plans to deploy Maritime Militia to the West Philippine Sea to match China's fleet. Geopolitical experts fear rising tensions, but on the other hand, an end by Manila on a ban on oil exploration has raised the specter of a joint venture in the West Philippine Sea between the Philippines and China. All this as President Rodrigo Duterte continues to show preference for China on COVID-19 vaccines.
all right, so the discussion tonight is going to be all about China-Philippines relations, and joining us from Beijing, live from Beijing, is none other than the Philippines Ambassador to China, Chito Sta. Romana. Good evening, Chito. Welcome to Viewpoint.
Good evening, Barnaby. I'm sorry if the signal is not so good, but thanks
That's
for
fine,
having
Chito.
me tonight.
That's fine, Chito. We are hearing you well. It's clear. So I think that should be enough for this discussion. And I see you, even though the picture is not moving, but I see you, and it's really nice to see you. Chito and I go way back when we were both working at the ABC News. He was bureau chief at ABC News in Beijing, and I was working in New York City. Now, Chito, before I get to our discussion, allow me to give a quick update to our viewers on what's going on with the weather. Because we have a typhoon that is approaching the Philippines right now, and this is the strongest storm on the planet this year. It is Typhoon Rolly, and as of 4 p.m. today, the eye of Typhoon Rolly, with an international name of Goni, was located around 345 kilometers east-northeast of Virac, Catanduanes. Now, it is maintaining maximum sustained winds of 215 kilometers an hour near the center and gustiness of up to 265 kilometers an hour. That is not a super typhoon. Super typhoon, according to Pag-asa, is at 220 kilometers an hour. But on the scale of the Joint Typhoon Warning Center of the U.S. Navy, this is already a super typhoon at 285 kilometers an hour. So it is nearing a super typhoon level based on Pag-asa's measure. It is a super typhoon based on the U.S. Navy's measure. It is a dangerous typhoon nonetheless, whether it is a super typhoon or a typhoon that is nearing super typhoon level. And one of the, of course, this is not yet on any, on the same level as Typhoon Yolanda and with an international name of Typhoon Haiyan back in 2013. But this is a typhoon that follows two other typhoons. So, and it is on a path that is the same as the path that the two other typhoons just last week took. So watch out for landslides and watch out for storm surges of more than 3 meters over the northern coastal areas of Quezon, including Polillo Islands, Camarines provinces, and Catanduanes. And there is also a danger of 2.1 to 3 meter storm surge over the coastal areas of Manila, Cavite, Bulacan, Pampanga, Bataan, the southeastern coastal area of Batangas, and the southwestern coastal area of Quezon. Signal number 3 is up. over the areas of Catanduanes, the eastern portion of Camarines Sur, and Albay. Here in Metro Manila, signal number 2 is up, as well as in Bulacan, Rizal, Laguna, Cavite, Batangas, Quezon Province, including Polillo Islands, Camarines Norte, the rest of Camarines Sur, Sorsogon, Masbate, Marinduque, Romblon, Oriental Mindoro, and Occidental Mindoro. Now, for the rest of the storm signal warnings, you can go to the website and the Facebook page of Pagasa. The storm is forecast to make landfall tomorrow morning over the Catanduanes, Camarines area, and it could also make landfall. It could make a direct hit in Metro Manila. So everyone, be careful, evacuate if necessary, be prepared. All right, Chito. So, hold on, let me see. Okay, Chito, you're still there, right?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry
Okay.
to hear about the typhoon.
Yes. Fortunately, it's not going to China, is it? I think it's going to. I think it's going to Vietnam, which has also been battered by typhoons over the last couple of weeks. By the way,
Recently,
right?
it's also been
Okay.
covered.
So I'm gonna switch gears right now, and I'm gonna get into the discussion, Chito. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna start all the way back to September, when President Rodrigo Duterte gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly, and in that speech, of course, he asserted for the first time the Philippines win at The Hague in 2016. Um, is that I mean, I don't know if anyone has ever asked you about that, because I did see you do a press conference this month, but that was last month. But is that speech turning a corner in the Philippines China relations? Is it a corner that's turning for the worse, or um, what are your thoughts about that speech?
Well, just to tell you, this is the first time that the president enunciated it in public at the UN at that. However, this is not the first time that the president has asserted this position. Actually, you go back a year ago when the president came here in August 2019, and he said it is now time to invoke the arbitral tribunal. And he did bring it up directly, although not publicly, with President Xi Jinping. I think the overall assessment is we've spent 3 years building up a reservoir of goodwill and friendship with China, and the two leaders have reached a certain level of understanding and camaraderie, so that the President Duterte, is of the opinion that the first a discussion of this issue, and bringing it up at the UN was, of course, a major undertaking, but it represents an assertion of the Philippine independent foreign policy. Basically, there has been what you would call a recalibration of the foreign policy going on over the past year, particularly from last year. And so basically, the arbitral tribunal is now part of the agenda and part of the agenda in the dialogue between the two countries. We have, of course, big disagreement on this, and the Chinese position hasn't changed, but we have brought it up to the Chinese directly, and we have brought it up to the international community. So this, as the president said way back when the arbitral award was announced in July 2016, he did make a policy position that he will uphold the rule of law and he will uphold the arbitral award. Of course,
Mhm.
we made some adjustments because we were trying to restore the improved relations with China. And we've gone through 3 years where first it was brought up at my level, at the level of the the deputy foreign secretary during the bilateral consultative mechanism, and then at the summit level, and this year now at the UN General Assembly level. So this it basically shows that no, we did not abandon the arbitral award. We just put it on what we call a separate track. A
Mhm.
track for disputes is one thing, and a separate track for areas where there are no disputes. And we have fast tracked the areas, and now we continue to discuss the areas where we have disputes,
So you're
including
saying
the
this,
arbitral award.
yes. So you're saying this is all part of the plan, because President Duterte in the past has always said, "There will come a time that I will raise it. There will come a time that I will raise it." And for 3 years he didn't, right? Publicly. But in September, he surprised all of us, or maybe it wasn't a surprise.
Also, this is a surprise for those who knew the president and his thinking, and those who, like in my case, I witnessed it at firsthand. He brought it up already with President Xi a year ago, and he's been bringing it up actually with ASEAN leaders. It's been discussed, of course, in diplomatic setting. But opportunity finally bring it up as part of an overall review of our foreign policy at the United Nations. So three last year, the president did say the time has come, and so
Mm.
what you have seen has basically shown that he has lived up to his word.
Mhm. And you're saying that we now have enough goodwill between the Philippines and China to be able to discuss this issue without damaging the other aspects of the relationship between the Philippines and China.
Well, because I think we have prepared the groundwork with the Chinese, and we have discussed it with them directly on a bilateral level. And so, although the Chinese, they listened, they actually registered their position also through their spokesman in public and through their UN representative. They gave their own position and that there is difference in position. I think the Chinese now they will not break relations as a result of that. That is
Mm.
very clear. They respect that we have our own position and that they recognize we have differences. And so we have to learn to disagree without being disagreeable and to discuss the differences without necessarily meaning that we will confront them. You see, the difference basically is whether you're going to have friendly and cooperative relations with the Chinese while reserving and standing on your principle and respecting the differences, or using the difference to confront the Chinese, in which case it's a different approach. So we have found a way to do it so that
Mm.
we can have a two-track approach.
Mm.
Continue to fast track areas where we have no differences: trade,
Mhm.
investment, science, education, the whole works. And then
Mm.
isolate the areas where we have differences and focus on them. And some of these
Mm.
differences are quite fundamental and may take time. So by being able to calibrate it in the right way, we're able to preserve good relations with China despite the differences.
But this is what critics are saying. How can we be friends with the neighbor who is taking away things from us? So, say for example, we live in the same subdivision, and your neighbor is taking away things from your backyard. How can you be friends with that neighbor?
We're simple. We have a claim on Sabah. Do we break relations with Malaysia? We have claims on the KIG, the Calayan Island Group, which Vietnam also claims. And as a matter of fact, there is one particular feature that they took in the previously Will we break relations with Vietnam? No. Just because you have territorial and maritime difference, the question is how to handle it. And so the logic is very simple. Just because you have differences, does that mean you break relations or you confront? You see, the problem, I think, in the past was we were viewed by China as like a pawn in a geopolitical rivalry, acting not on our own interests, but on the interests of an international coalition against China. Now the Chinese recognize that we have an independent foreign policy and that we have a friendly and cooperative policy with China. It doesn't mean that we're giving up our territorial and maritime. And when you say that they're taking away things, did they take over Pagasa? Did they reclaim Scarborough? Did they take out the ship at Ayungin Shoal? So we have reached a line where the red lines are, and we're trying to maintain the situation. The basic position, I think, of the Philippines is to hold on to what we have, not to lose anything more, not to repeat the mistakes that were committed that led to the loss of Scarborough Shoal, and to hold on. And we were able to what? To build, to improve the facilities at Pagata, despite the differences in position, because we understand each other. And we explained to the Chinese that this does not constitute a threat to China, that improving the facilities. Of course, we object to the deployment of military personnel, deployment of military resources in the artificial island. We object to the land reclamation. But it's because we do it through peaceful and diplomatic means, resorting to peaceful and diplomatic means instead of a confrontational approach is the basic key how we're able to do it. So China, take a look, the second largest economy, soon to be the largest economy. By dint of geography, we cannot move to Hawaii, to Guam, or to California. We may wish to, it's possible. So we have to learn to live with a neighbor. Now we have fundamental differences in terms of defining the way they define their territory and sovereign jurisdiction. This is the key. But just because they're asserting their jurisdiction, we also counter-assert, do it in a confrontational approach. There are times we do it through diplomatic notes. There are times we do it through statements. But the fact is, we've been able to hold the line. And this is what's important. Of course, the Chinese were to take over Pagasa. If they were to reclaim and give up, they no longer, they give up their word that they won't reclaim Scarborough. If they were to take over Ayungin, now that's different. So we watch their action. There are certain challenges, but it does not mean that we cannot have friendly and cooperative relations. The basic paradigm is that China, you can deal with China as a friend, but it does not mean you give up your territorial and maritime claims. You engage China, but you also need to take your position on areas where you have principled position, and you push back where necessary. This is part of the overall strategy of hedging. We want to be friends with all, and the U.S., and this is exactly the basis of our independence.
Okay, since you mentioned the U.S., some observers, after President Duterte delivered that speech at the UN General Assembly, said that, or were asking if the Philippines is pivoting back to the U.S. Because of what President Duterte had said during the UN General Assembly. We all know that the U.S. is having an election next week, and the Trump administration lately has asserted its right to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea very strongly in the last several months or in the last year or so. I mean, what are your thoughts about the U.S. election? How is it going to affect the geopolitics in this region?
Well, I think independent of the results of the US election, we have to recognize that the world has changed. And as a result, there is growing, intensifying geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, primarily over East Asia, particularly over the waters from East China Sea, South China Sea, which the Chinese consider as their near waters, as well as the areas where they have territorial and maritime claims. Now, the basic question here really is how do you position yourself in this geopolitical rivalry? Based on an assessment of the changing international situation, there was a time when the U.S. was having its unipolar moment. U.S. was dominant. The Chinese were nowhere near in terms of economic military strength. Now we're coming to a situation where the Chinese are gaining, and are in a sense challenging the dominant position of the U.S. From the point of view of the Philippines, we would like to maintain and enlarge our strategic autonomy, maintain our friendship with both sides. At the same time, of course, you have to maneuver. And this is why some people may be confused. Sometimes it looks like a pivot to China. Sometimes it looks like a pivot to the US. This is part of navigating the troubled waters of the South China Sea. Just like you're navigating a boat, you don't always keep a straight line. You're trying to, but because of the waves, because of the movements, you sometimes veer right, but you want to maintain your independence initiative and to maximize the benefits for our nation and the Filipino people. It's hard to maximize our leverage because of our strategic location. The Philippines, because strategic location is very important to both China and the US. And we don't hope to cut our ties with either one. We may be critical of China territorial and maritime issues. We may be critical of the US at times because what interference at our domestic internal affairs. So it depends on the circumstances, and basically it depends on the geopolitical situation.
So within the context of regional geopolitics, do you think it would be better for the Philippines and by extension Philippines-China relations? Do you think it looked like an Obama presidency would be better?
Well, I'm not an expert on American politics. My point of view is the Philippine national interest. I think we should be prepared for either. It is difficult to say now how things will go. But we've had Trump for 4 years. We've had Obama before that. Let's see first the results of the election next week. All it can be resolved next week. And then we have to evaluate the situation. As of now, it's best to be prepared for both possibilities. And it
All right.
has its own characteristics.
Mhm. Okay, let's go now to the visit of Foreign Affairs Secretary Teddy Locsin Jr. to China a few weeks ago. Now, you mentioned that now the two sides can discuss territorial issues, South China Sea issues, because of what President Duterte had said during the UN General Assembly. So, was it discussed between Secretary Locsin and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi?
Well, there's a whole communique that was released right after the visit. But if I may review the highlights, the first priority, I think, given the situation now, is really how to cooperate further on regarding the pandemic, because this is the main item in the agenda right now. It outweighs the territorial and maritime issue. It outweighs all the other issues. So that was the top of the discussion, and both sides resolved to continue cooperating. I should tell you that as of now, there have been more than 60 Philippine Air Force flights, including flights by Philippine Airlines or by recently the flight of Pan Pacific Airlines. It was hired by the Red Cross. That was the Chinese authorities allowed this. They flew over the sea and landed in China to pick up supplies, PPEs, the materials testing equipment, as well as the more equipment in terms of having more anti-pandemic cooperation. There is also a plan to share information on how to deal with the virus. China has been able to basically control and to go on the path of economic recovery. So I think there is a China's foremost expert, Dr. Zhongnan, who was recently here in China for what he did in terms of helping in both the medical and the country's strategy for controlling the virus. He will hold the with this Philippine now being worked out soon. And basically, there was a discussion about vaccine development. Foreign Minister Wang Yi reiterated what President Duterte and President Xi had already several months before, that when the Chinese have the vaccine, that the Chinese will consider it as a global public good and provide access to the world, to the international community, and that the Philippines will be among the priorities countries to receive the vaccine. So aside from that, of course, there was discussion on how to move forward on oil and gas, how to continue the discussions on the South China Sea, and how to maintain the situation so that it won't lead to a crisis or a miscalculation, but to continue the bilateral dialogue, consultation regarding this issue. As you know, because of the pandemic, the bilateral consultation meetings have been postponed, have been suspended, simply because neither side could travel to each other's country, and so we're trying to revive it now. Hopefully, when the Philippine side is able to control, and the Chinese can come over because it's our turn to host them, as well as to continue the joint meeting of the steering committee on oil and gas. But in the meantime, I think both sides have agreed that the companies involved in the oil and gas cooperation can continue meeting whenever it's possible to do so. And so there was a whole range of review. There was also a discussion on how to resume the infrastructure projects that were affected by the pandemic. And part of it, of course, is that we basically stopped issuing visas here at our embassy to any foreigner, in particular, including the Chinese. So now it's how to have a fast lane and how to resume we have already done it. We have resumed visas to Chinese engineers and managers, the infrastructure that the Chinese government is financing in the Philippines.
Okay. I'm gonna pick up on some of the things that you said. And the first one is the oil and gas exploration. There was a report here in the Philippine media saying that China has said that China and the Philippines have reached a consensus on oil and gas exploration. Well, what is this consensus? Are you privy to what the Chinese side has said?
Well, no, the consensus, I think if we're referring to the same thing, the consensus is the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding on Oil and Gas Cooperation in 2018 when President, and the continuing consensus is how to, the MOU provides so we're basically following that roadmap. And, the lifting of the moratorium if there is no lifting of the moratorium, how can there be any cooperation with anybody in oil and gas exploration? Because then you can't do anything. So you first it. As a matter of fact, it's overdue. There were some things would be done as early as last year, the first half or the second half of the year. So the fact that because of the pandemic, some certain things had to be suspended or delayed, and this is one of those. The lifting is actually to what we call an improving situation between China and the Philippines, as well as improving situation insofar as the South China Sea situation is concerned. But now the moratorium and cooperation or exploration can continue. Basically, there are already service contracts there. So it's how to now the companies with service contracts are now under obligation to start investing, to start hiring people. So that is why you will see in the next few weeks and the next few months more exploration happening
So, so
in these areas where there are already.
Right. So you're positive that this joint venture between China and the Philippines, or Chinese oil company and the Philippine oil company, would materialize? Because Greg Polling, for example, of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, that's based in DC, he said that the lifting of the moratorium would probably not matter, because China would never recognize the Philippines' sovereign rights over these waters. And
Well,
former Supreme
maybe,
Court Justice Antonio Carpio, he said that in effect, if China goes into this deal with the Philippines, in effect, it's China's dropping its claims in those waters.
uh, the situation, of course, is still challenging. The CNOC, the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company, and the Philippine counterpart, they have to continue discussing. They have to come up with a commercial contract, and we have to see the terms. And the Joint Steering Committee, the Intergovernment Joint Steering Committee, will have to vet and approve this. But it will, if ever there will be an agreement, it will be along the path, the roadmap that is provided by the MOU on oil and gas in 2018. Just read it again to achieve something that will be in accordance with that MOU. I am cautiously optimistic, but both sides have to work hard. And so there are still hurdles and challenges. But if you don't lift the moratorium, how can you have any exploration if there's a ban? So the first requirement is really lift the moratorium, and then the two sides can talk, come up with an agreement, and the contract is whether it's in accord, on the Philippine side, whether it's acceptable to both sides, and only then can we tell. I know there are skeptics around. It is, of course, this is a challenge we are facing, and this is the work of diplomacy. Diplomacy. So we're pushing the envelope. We're trying to see if we can reach this, but this agreement, the Philippine Constitution allows for joint ventures. It may be, the point of view and even of the Philippine Constitution, some of these areas are within our exclusive economic zone. While they're exclusive to us, it does not mean we cannot share rights or the exploration. This is provided for according to Philippine law, and it is exactly a form of joint development. The Quito agreement and contract that will be defined, the two companies can formulate one that is acceptable to both sides, compatible with both sides.
But is it
Or other position?
right? But is it
This
possible?
is a challenge. Is this possible at all? Well, If you look
I
at
mean,
the
is it possible
MOU,
at
we
all
didn't think it was
for either side to not
possible.
drop their claim for this to be able to happen?
What's that?
Is it possible
Sorry,
at all for
didn't
either
get the
side to not drop its claim for this to be able to happen?
well, in China, the formula is, can you set aside your differences and form a joint venture? From the point of view of the Philippines, it's how to do it in accordance with the fusion. So you can see what we're saying, what challenges. What I'm trying to tell you is, in a couple of months, watch out, because we're trying to find the solution. And whether we'll find it or not, as I said, cautiously optimistic, but both sides, the level of understanding, the hurt, and are trying to find. It will take a lot of creativity, a lot of pragmatism, flexibility without giving up. How to do that? That is the challenge.
Now, what do you think about this plan by the
Do
Philippines to deploy maritime militia? Of course, we already know that China has been using maritime militia in the South China Sea for years, but it's really only now that the Philippines has expressed a plan to deploy a maritime militia in the South China Sea. Do you feel this is a plan that is in line with how the Duterte government has been dealing with China all throughout these 4 years? Or do you feel that this could derail the goodwill between the Philippines and China?
Well, I think it's a lot of details still. One thing unique in the Philippines is we think of things, we also we also publish it and broadcast it. We don't hide anything to to anybody. So it's interesting. However, I think they're talking of the numbers involved are quite small. It probably won't make a lot of difference. However, I think the idea of mobilizing fishermen, or in this case, I think it's like research. The Chinese case too is they mobilize their fishermen. They these people are only militia. The whole concept of very traditional solution is really how to mobilize. Not only but the non-military, the people, the ordinary people. So one approach they've used is really to experiment, to recruit them, and to give them proper leadership. So you have to solve a number of problems to be able to, the basic approach here, how to counter the use of maritime militia by the Chinese. Better in terms of the planning, in terms of the resources, in terms of the rules of engagement. Work in progress in the right direction, but there's a lot of details that are confident our sector, our military people, will put their best brains into this and be able to do it in a way that will promote our national. Want to are
So,
not well trained
so
or
you,
who
in
are
other
not
words,
properly led,
right? In other
properly
words,
equipped. But
in other
if the
words, you're not
idea is
against
to
it.
improve then it would be a step in the right direction.
In other words, you're not against it, but you want to wait for more details from the Navy.
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I certainly am not privy to it, being in Beijing. I think most of the thinking but the basic idea I understand, and that's to counter this tactic. But remember, the gray zone tactic tactic really, it's called grades because it's between black and white. Black being war and white being peace. And yet short of the threshold of war. And so what we should do is really how to be able to count in a way that will not promote more encounters, but
Mm.
actually will promote more protection for the fishermen. The only suggestion I have is they should coordinate it closely and with the fishery bureaus and with the fishermen. I mean, so that you have a whole of society approach, a whole of government approach, and of course this will entail resources and at a time of pandemic, resources to do this, or whether you start the groundwork first and the preparations. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think it points to a direction that could help in terms of monitoring the situation there, because we have to know what the situation to protect and
Mm.
our fish.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on one last thing that you said earlier on infrastructure, because you said that that was one thing that was discussed during the meeting between Secretary Locsin and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. So, infrastructure and investments. When President Duterte first went to China, there was a $24 billion pledge from China. Now, one of the criticisms has been that this has not materialized, that very few of these investment pledges from China have actually turned into reality. I mean, there are only 2 more years in the Duterte administration. Is there still a chance that we'll see most of these investment pledges materialize?
Well, actually, if you look at the record, uh, what there's been more challenges along the way in terms of, but you have to turn it to reality, and then you have to combine the two parties. It's the first time our two governments together after a period of estrangement. However, there's still 2 years, and I think there will be, and then you have to factor in the pandemic. So there is a problem. I think this has been at the highest level. Secretary Locsin has taken. Chinese are aware of this. They're trying to explain their position, but they will try hard to what the contracts that have been signed to make sure they're implemented. There's still some contracts that are being worked out, and to see if that can or if that can be finalized so that the work can be done in the coming 2 years. So I think the final accounting will have to be done. Give it a year and a half, and I think the Chinese, part promises of the government in terms of projects. I think when sign contracts at the end of 2 years, it
Mm.
will it will reach the goal and probably exceed it. Now, for the investments, this is a work in progress. But if you notice in the past 2 years, 3 years ago, is not at all in the top three in the Philippines. Then 2 years ago, they entered the top five. And then last year, they were number two already.
Mm.
So in terms of investment, they have been catching up. They still have a long way to go. And a lot of Chinese investors, actually, there were investment privy to. The Chinese team were supposed to visit the Philippines in the first quarter of this year. It would help a lot in terms of industrial, certain industrial sectors that we don't have, that we have to build on. Unfortunately, they were affected by the pandemic, and now it's how to restore it if it's still possible. But there's still time. So I think the final accounting will be done. Of course, we can do a mid term accounting. It has not lived up to the promises, but that is the nature of both infrastructure projects and investment, there is a gestation period. What you take into account are at the end the money that was brought in and the investment contracts as well as investment realized. So I think if you look at the record, true, we ourselves bringing this up in discussions with Chinese, and so I expect a catch up happening in the next few months, and
Right.
certainly the next 2 years.
Well, when we're talking about Chinese investments, though, we're not talking about the online gambling, are we? Because you said that China is now number
No,
two
no, no.
investor in the
That,
Philippines, and
that
Chito,
well,
there is a
that's
concern from some senators here in the Philippines that there there seems to be a soft invasion of China here in the Philippines.
yeah. I read the figure 4 million. This is well. I don't hope to continue because I think it will show that. But if you add all the visas that the Chinese, the Philippine, or the Philippine government has issued to the Chinese, it may amount to 4 million. 4 million are still there. I really, I think you'll find some are still there. I don't know the exact number, but partly driven by the pogos, but even the pogos now, I think pogos, we may see actually the decline, the impending decline. And it may not be the demise because you see it services not only the Chinese mainland, but also Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Chinese diaspora around the world, as well as non-Chinese the Chinese mainland component of it. I think there's an ongoing crackdown here in China, and that's why a lot of you'll see it online, and there the Chinese work coming back, partly because of the pandemic, partly business conditions. So as a result of this, I think the pogos will decline, and what we will see are other investments. What's
Mm.
happening already? They're building a investment zone there.
So
Look
you're
at
not, yeah,
Luzon, in
right.
southern Luzon, in,
You're not concerned
and take a
about
look
this.
at the figures of the
Yeah, you're not concerned about this so-called soft invasion then, because aside from the
yes.
senator saying that they're concerned about a soft invasion, there is also ex AFP chief General Emmanuel Bautista saying that China is now employing a gray zone strategy, um, which basically means that they're not necessarily employing conventional military tactics to invade the Philippines, but they're using their economic power. Um, they're using, all these different instruments to establish a foothold in the Philippines. And he even goes as far as saying that that China could invade the Philippines in case of a shooting war between China and the U.S.
Wow, that's really a war game scenario. It is possible, just like it could be the US that would take over the Philippines, another war game scenario. Anything is possible if total war breaks out. In a nuclear war, we can only pray, say goodbye, because nothing will be left standing. I think it is a misreading of the situation. I think it is a misreading of the situation in the sense that we're very good in fighting the last war. We think it's going to be the Japanese invasion or like a Hitler type of invasion. The fact is, the gray strategy itself should be clear to everyone that it's not a total war. It is short of war, and that's why you have to be vigilant, but you also resort to hysteria or just to label China as the enemy so as to justify a policy of alignment with the US, be part of a NATO. That is not our view of the situation. We would like to maintain our strategic autonomy. We would like to play a constructive role between the two powers. We encourage them to resort to resolve their differences peacefully, diplomatically, go back to the negotiating table, to militarization. Because, as the president said, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffer. And so, if there's actual fighting between the two elephants, Philippines will really suffer. That is why we stand together with ASEAN countries, choosing neither China nor the US, not encouraging to continue with their rivalry, but while recognizing that, but at the same time trying to maximize our own strategic autonomy and preventing the outbreak of a war. It is possible there will be limited military action. And so, it's possible. I mean, the military, their job is to engage in war game scenario, and that is actually just one scenario. There are other scenarios possible, exactly the opposite. But the point I'm making driving is a gray zone is precisely how to operate below the threshold of war. And so we have to deal with it in that context. We have to
I,
be vigilant, be hysterical.
I mean, I don't think that anybody wants a shooting war, right? We are running out of time now. Actually, we're already running over time. So I'm going to just ask you one last question. How do you see, I mean, do you see an ending to this dispute between China and the Philippines, given that China, I don't see China backing down on its claims in the South China Sea, and the Philippines is also basically not backing down on its claims in the West Philippine Sea and in the South China Sea. So, I mean, given that, is there any is there
Well,
any end
I
in sight
think,
here
and
where
this is
where
a
it's not a shooting war, of
rhetorical,
course?
it's to the differences. We may not be able to solve the territorial dispute in the near future or within my lifetime, but we can manage it so that it does not become a hurdle to further cooperation between the two countries. In other words, you have the dispute on this side, and you can continue cooperating where you can and maximize the benefits for the ordinary Filipino people as well as people. On the maritime side, there may be areas where you can actually solve some aspects, or it would also take some time because the Chinese have also changed their tactics, and it can be discussed in another forum. But on the 9-dash line, they have revised it to what they call the four island group strategy, which is actually trying to have their claim with own clause, but in the process they're basically bending own clause. So that's why we must have a protracted view of this struggle. The important thing, 4 years ago and now, we have the same issues in a sense, the same fundamental issues underlying. What has changed is the approach, so that you can discuss the differences while doing it on a bilateral track. Before, we only had a one-track approach. Here are the differences. If we don't solve them, we cannot cooperate on anything. You freeze the relations. What we found is that you can have a two-track, separate it into two tracks, one track, and then you can have the discussions on the other track and try to avoid that it clogs up the relationship. You improve the atmosphere and create the atmosphere that ultimately lead solution. It will take time though. Don't those who expect to do it overnight.
All right. Um, I didn't hear the end of what you said, Chito, but I think you already ended your answer. So on that note, thank you so much for joining us tonight on Viewpoint. That's Philippine Ambassador to China, Chito Santa Romana. Jose Santiago, Chito Santa Romana, rather. I'm so used to calling him just Chito because of the years of work that we did together. We were both at ABP News. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, my name is Barnaby Lo. This is Viewpoint. You can catch us every Saturday live at 6 p.m. on the Now You Know Facebook page. And now it's not just on the Now You Know Facebook page. We're also live on Twitter as well as on the Now You Know YouTube page. Take care, everyone. It's going to be a long, long weekend for many of us here in Luzon. Stay safe.